Hello, and thank you for the invitation to talk today. My name is Georgina Groves, and I'm from World Welfare. And today I'm going to talk to you about ethics in animals and why we should care. I'm going to talk about how ethical considerations support good practice in your zoo and aquarium and can help us make difficult and critical decisions, both in our day-to-day care of animals, but also for more fundamental decisions. To establish as a credible zoo in the 21st century, we need to ensure that all our positions and practices taken are backed by both sound science and the sound ethical framework. Science can provide us with important facts about animals and the environment, but can still leave some people asking, so what? We might know what animals need from a behavioural, environmental and healthcare sense through science, but it doesn't necessarily answer why we should provide it. Essentially, why should we care? And sometimes providing for those needs 24/7 will clash with other practices that we might want to carry out in a zoo. Meaning that while science shows us what we need to provide animals, this isn't always the option we can or want to provide them under our care. This means that there is a conflict between practices. Some of these practices that conflict with providing animals with best practice care may have an educational or veterinary value to them and potentially only a short-term impact. Others more obviously will conflict on the animal and its needs. However, whether they should be carried out or not depends on how you value the varying practices. Ethics allows you to consider these conflicts and provide guidance on how you ought to act under these circumstances. Many people think ethics is governed by emotions and beliefs. However, good ethical consideration isn't actually concerned with this. The term is actually derived from the Greek word ethos, which can mean custom, habit, character, or disposition. And it's a system of moral principles. It's concerned with what is good for individuals and society, and it's also described as a moral philosophy. Our concept of ethics is being derived from religions and cultures, and therefore can differ globally. However, when it comes to making moral decisions about animals, ethics should be, while morally just, scientifically driven and evidence-based. So ethics can provide a moral map. And most moral issues, for example, animal euthanasia, can get us pretty worked up. These involve emotional issues, and we often lead by our hearts, and they do our arguing while our brains just go with the flow. But there's another way to tackle these sorts of issues using sound ethical rules and principles that enable us to take a cooler view of moral problems. But moral decisions are complex, and what ethics doesn't do is provide you necessarily with just one answer. This is because their issues are complex, but instead, ethical consideration helps eliminate confusion and provide some clear choices. After that, it's up to each individual to come up with their own conclusions. For some of us, this moral ambiguity can be difficult. We want decisions to be made for us, but this can force us to take responsibility for the choices that we make every day, rather than falling back on convenient rules and customs. And this is important. Rules and regulations can be pretty standard in zoos, and they are important for both animal and human safety, but they can also be based often on historic practices. From a management perspective and a science perspective, they work. They may not be perfect for the animal, but that's not seen as enough to change them. However, good ethical consideration starts challenging these practices, and appropriate ethical conduct helps us make significant steps forward in animal practice and welfare. So let's take these statements. Each statement could be morally acceptable or unacceptable depending on how we value that animal, and therefore whether, even if it's not in the best interest of the animal, something else has outweighed the interest of the animal and justified the action taken. But how do we decide if this is an acceptable justification? Well, we can start doing this by considering what values we might assign to animals. And to consider this, I just want to share this short video.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue, clouds of white, bright, blessed days, dark, sacred night. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colours of a rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? They're really saying, I love you. I hear babies cry. I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Quite simply wonderful.
I think we can all agree by watching this video how wonderful, creative, diverse and special nature and animals are, that they have value to us and this planet, but also value to themselves, irrespective of that value to us. This is called intrinsic value, and it describes those things that are valuable in their own right, irrespective of their value to others. It's defined as the inherent worth of something, independent of its worth to anyone or anything else. And it's commonly considered that individual animals, populations, and even ecosystems all have intrinsic value. In contrast to intrinsic value, there's extrinsic value, and this refers to all other types of value which are dependent on an external value. Examples of extrinsic value are instrumental, the usefulness of something to achieve some other end, e.g. cows are instrumental, have instrumental value insofar as they produce milk. Aesthetic value, the beauty of artwork, or economic value, the financial benefits that a resource might provide, such as timber, for example. And of course, some things have both intrinsic and extrinsic value. A bee may have intrinsic value, but also extrinsic value in terms of its usefulness to the plant that it pollinates. Recognizing the value of things helps us understand how best to look after them and treat them on a day-to-day basis. Those that have intrinsic value are generally thought to deserve that special consideration, and that they cannot simply be used as a means to an end. And this special consideration is often referred to as a moral status. So let us just compare an elephant, say, to a tractor. An elephant may have extrinsic value to other species in the wild, or even to its owner or a zoo, but it also has intrinsic value that is independent from anything else, anything or anyone else. A tractor only has extrinsic value, instrumental value to the farmer that uses it on his or her land. The elephant has moral status, the tractor does not. If we agree that each and every animal in its own right has intrinsic value, irrespective of the values to others, they have moral status, and we can start identifying ways to ensure their best interests are met. Science tells us that many species have sentience and consciousness, that they are autonomous creatures with their own desires, wants, and needs. Most people will agree that animals have moral standing, but to what degree they have it is dependent on one's own ethical beliefs. This is a really simplified diagram that's designed to show the spectrum of different views within the field of animal ethics. It goes from anthropocentrism, which is essentially human beings only have intrinsic value, animal welfare, which is the capacity for animals to have sentience and some intrinsic value, animal protectionism, where all individuals have intrinsic value that needs to be weighed up against other considerations, and animal rights, where all individual animals have intrinsic value, and this means that they should be having corresponding rights. And the bottom two lines of the text on the slide give examples of the kind of positions that these theories would argue for. Most zoos tend to fall under the animal welfare towards the animal protectionism scale. They believe that most animal use is okay, but it should be done under careful consideration. Under the animal welfare view, some practices, therefore, are never permissible. These are practices that damage or destroy the integrity of living things for frivolous reasons, such as intentional cruelty or use in harmful entertainment. However, there are practices that aren't so clearly non-permissible, but they may also conflict with providing the best care practice to an animal. And this is called, considered a conflict of interests. And within the zoo environment, there will always be a conflict of moral interest for a number of reasons. Whether that's a conflict between how you manage an animal and possible threats to human health and safety. So, for example, you might have to lock an animal in at night to prevent a risk of escape, or a conflict between the survival of a species and the interests of an individual animal. So you might have to hold an individual animal in perhaps a substandard enclosure for species and management purposes, or conflict between the necessity to achieve a specific zoo objective like fundraising or education against an animal's individual welfare. Conflict arises in most situations, and there is a need to consider all the values involved and the consequence of the choices made, as this can affect the conclusions we reach about how we ought to act. Effectively, you have to grade the various values and their moral status in conflict situations to decide which value is more important. What we're doing here is essentially considering these consequences. Within this conflict, you must decide whether or not the conflicting value outweighs the intrinsic value of the animal, and what the consequences of taking different actions would be. So let's take an animal interaction. Carrying out an animal interaction in a zoo will have consequences, both positive and negative. Not carrying out an animal interaction can have consequences, both positive and negative. So there's value to both carrying out an animal interaction and not carrying out an animal interaction. And one must weigh up the resulting consequences and consider if they still protect the integrity of the living animal that you've assigned a moral status to. But remember, this also depends on the species and its status. Whether it does conflict or not will depend on what that species is, its specific needs, and the moral status you've assigned to it. So, for example, a plant will have a lower moral status than an animal, as it is a non-conscious being. A tiger and a tortoise may have the same moral status, but the tiger may have more specific needs that cannot be met during an interaction, and therefore its interests and integrity is much harder to protect. So let's refer back to this slide. Are these statements correct? Well, as discussed, that depends on the value you assign the animal and also the value you assign to other things associated with those actions. It also depends on the scientific evidence about the welfare impact of these activities. So let's take riding an elephant. We've assigned the elephant intrinsic value, therefore it has moral status, and as such we must protect its integrity. To do that, we must provide it with an environment that meets its needs and its interests. The humans or the keepers that potentially will be looking after this elephant when it's ridden also have intrinsic value. Riding also can have extrinsic value, that means that there are conflicting interests now with this particular practice. Therefore, we'll have to consider the consequences of these different values and whether they conflict with providing the integrity of the elephant and to what degree. We know that elephants are highly social, smart, and complex. Evidence continually demonstrates that riding elephants can severely compromise their welfare by limiting natural behaviours. It can cause physical and psychological harm by requiring harsh or aversive training, and equipment can cause physical wounding. So combining the need to protect the integrity and evidence to show that riding will harm them, it can be deemed that the consequence to their integrity cannot be protected. Therefore, it is morally unacceptable to do so. This is a fairly straightforward decision. As well, there may be some conflicting interests, those public and economic values. The protection of the status of the elephants and scientific evidence that we have about elephant riding means these conflicts are not to be taken too seriously. But what about the other statements? Well, this depends on the value you assign the animal and other factors involved, including the humans that might be part of that practice. It will depend on what the conflicting values are, and it's going to depend on the specific needs of the animal, and therefore how you will protect its integrity. You will then weigh out these conflicting consequences and evaluate the ethical values against the information and evidence you have on that animal, and then make a moral decision. So back to this slide on this spectrum of ethical beliefs. I mentioned before that most zoos fall within the animal welfare and some of the animal protectionist scale. However, as demonstrated, we should be considering the moral status and weighing up the moral and ethical decision on almost every aspect of our zoo care when it comes to welfare. I personally feel that zoos should work towards animal protectionism and ensuring that care consideration is given to all usage of animals with strict guiding principles that are governed also by increasing scientific knowledge. So just for example, as we continue to explore the inner lives of animals, we know that cephalopods are intelligent, sentient creatures. Fish feel pain and suffer, and many species have these complex inner social lives, and we should be affording them the protection they deserve. So good ethical consideration helps make informed decisions. It helps zoos and animal carers consider forward-thinking decisions, and it provides frameworks for making those decisions. Remember, ethics doesn't provide one single answer. It provides clarity on how to make decisions, but the final decision is down to an individual or team of people. It helps us answer questions on welfare, rights, consequentialism, virtue, and environmental ethics, and expands our thinking and understanding, not just for the megafauna or the cute and cuddly, but for all living creatures that could have moral status. Finally, good ethical consideration helps us as animal carers justify our actions and provide that accountability, as it demonstrates due processes and appropriate consideration of an individual animal's value and worth.